Hello and welcome to Can Month Day 17. I am super sick today because my father has very kindly bequeathed upon me his stomach virus, which is presumably payback for every time I've been sick as a child. Today I'm going to be talking about the best nonfiction book I have read this year, and there were some good contenders there, as you saw earlier in the month with Michael Adams and Stephen Lewis, but this book blew them all away, and it is Bred Out of Stone, Recollections on Sex, Recognitions, Race, Dreaming, and Politics by Dionne Brand. Dionne Brand moved to Canada from Trinidad, and a lot of the themes covered in this book, and it sounds like a lot of her other works as well, include sexism, men's violence against women, the eroticism and media stereotypes of Black women, white domination, and the moral hypocrisy of Canada. The writing style is very personal and poetic. She writes in a very postmodernist way that's a little bit more stream of consciousness, which is something I don't normally like and I find hard to read. So after about the first chapter of getting used to it, it starts to make a lot of sense because it just makes it so much easier to communicate her ideas. Everything in this book is just super important and interesting, and that's why pretty much every chapter has been tabbed off. But I've just kind of made a list of a lot of the things that I found specifically really interesting. So she talks a lot about the 1970s Black liberation movement that was happening in Canada and how people moving to Canada from Africa and the Caribbean would go to specific parts of Toronto, and in those spaces they would be able to just be themselves and wear what they want, talk how they wanted to, without the constant pressure and overcast of white expectations. She also talks a lot about the younger generation's place in that movement, so that would have been like Gen X, because they would have been younger at that time, and what it was like to be, first generation in Canada at that time, and the different kinds of anger at how they were being treated and how that had to be expressed differently. For instance, because this is happening in the 70s after so many Black activists were killed and murdered in the 60s, that a lot of parents were fearful for that kind of outward anger and calls for change and justice. And something else that she mentioned as well is the idea that, particularly for young Black boys, that the only way that white people see you, and your only two options, are to either be a superstar, either with sports or music, or a criminal. And those are basically your only two options. She talks about how communism was involved in the Black liberation movement and how that caused a lot of factions within the movement, because again, this is happening in the 70s, Cold War. She discusses police murders of young Black men, or boys essentially, and how this has been ongoing and has always been a thing in Canada, as it has always been in the US, but never gets talked about in Canada ever, because racialized police murders are just a little bit less than happens in the US. It's just apparently not a problem here, I guess. And she discusses how she was actually involved in a communist revolution in Grenada, and how later in life, when she tells people about this, that they're like, oh, how could you be communist? Stalin, do you not remember Stalin? And she's like, excuse me, like, I can think of so many people like that in the history of capitalism, yet those people will never discredit that entire system. So I also found her talking about James Baldwin to be really interesting, because I haven't read any of his books yet, but I want to, and I know that Giovanni's Room is like a very important queer book. But she talks about how even he was unable to escape misogynistic assumptions in writing his female characters, and the fact that they were either matrons or sexual objects, and that's the only space that Black women can occupy, apparently, in literature. And what she really gets at so well in this book is the racialized patriarchy. So one of the quotes in her book that just kind of sums up the point that she's trying to make is that patriarchy makes us see what happens to men as more offensive than what happens to women. So she talks about how there is a lot of violence against Black women from Black men within the community, but because of hierarchy and solidarity, women have to band together with men, and then also the gendered hierarchy within the movement. And this is something that I find as a kind of a common theme in terms of feminist criticisms of leftist movements, because this is something that happens all the time and still happens, where even in left to very far left movements, there's always still a gender hierarchy. She also talks a lot about literature and race and gender and sexual orientation, especially in terms of lesbianism, because she is also a lesbian. And when she's touching on the moral hypocrisy of Canada, one example of this that she talks about is panels about race, where it would be her and 3 other white dudes asking the question, does racism in Canada still exist? And how, like, there were so many times when she just went off and shut them down. One of the things she mentioned that I thought was interesting too is, this is published in like 1994, so it might be a little bit different, but at the time she was discussing how in Canada, like, that's still, you know, a popular panel discussion topic, whereas in the US, it was kind of just assumed and you would never see that. Whereas, I mean, now you do with Fox News, but... And that is just a fraction of all the stuff that is so incredibly written about in this book. And the reason that I loved this book so much was because I actually learned from it and I was challenged and being pushed to understand things. Because this book is intersectional feminism and it is an intersectional feminist critique of Canada. And I really, really wish these books were more the mainstream right now in terms of feminist literature, because right now a lot of what I see in bookstores is a lot of white middle class feminism, and although some of it is very intersectional and talks about feminism as being intersectional, like Caitlin Moran's How to Be a Woman, but you are limited in your perspective in talking about intersectionality when you're white middle class woman. We need more books like this that are written by people who are experiencing a multitude of different areas of privilege and oppression, and especially because this book is so accessible and incredible. Of course, there is a place for the kind of starter feminist books, as I call them, and they are very important to get started, and they were important for me as well. But books like this need to be step 1.5, and this book was written in like 1994, and I'm like, why is this not one of the most well-known feminist books ever in Canada even? I just really need more people to read this book, please and thank you. I also really want to read more of Dionne Brand's work, so if you have heard of any or have read any yourself, please let me know.